All right, so you're someone into philosophy, right? I
Yeah.
mean, I think it's safe to say if you're listening to this, you're probably fascinated by thinkers who just love to wrestle with those really big questions,
Mm,
the ones that have been bugging us for like, well, forever.
totally. And today we're going to dive into a figure who, well, he's kind of an unusual one in the history of philosophy.
Yeah, he's almost like a philosophical mystery.
A case study for a philosopher, even. Someone who shows us that impact and influence, they don't always show up how you'd expect.
Okay, I like that. So who's this enigmatic figure?
Let's talk Abraham ibn Ezra. Born in Muslim Spain around 1093, died sometime after 1167.
All right, so he's got that medieval vibe going. But what makes him such a puzzle, especially for someone who, you know, digs philosophy?
Well, here's the thing. He's recognized in Jewish philosophical history, but, and this is where it gets interesting, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, pretty authoritative source. Well, they say he, and I'm quoting here, contributed virtually nothing to any of the branches of philosophy.
Whoa, hold on. So we're talking about a guy who's considered a significant figure, but didn't actually do philosophy in the traditional sense.
It seems that way. And get this, there's no evidence he had any, formal philosophical training. Not like someone like, say, Maimonides.
Okay, yeah, that's wild.
Yeah.
But he's still there in the philosophical record. So what are we trying to figure out today?
The big question is how? How did this guy, mainly known for his work outside of philosophy like astronomy, astrology, Hebrew grammar, even biblical commentary, how did he end up in the philosophical conversation at all?
Right. It's not like he's crafting complex metaphysical systems or groundbreaking ethical theories.
Nope, nothing like that.
But, and I think this is where it gets super intriguing for us, his ideas, scattered throughout his other works, they caught the attention of later thinkers. People actually respected his thoughts on certain things.
You got it. It's this gap, the lack of a formal, concentrated philosophical output, but the presence of a lasting influence. That's what we're going to poke at today.
All right, so less of a philosopher, more of a philosophical enigma. But what were these influential ideas? What did he actually say that got people talking?
So we've got this short list of doctrines, as our source calls it. Let's start with his idea of divine governance. He believed God ruled the material world, but get this, through the celestial bodies, like the stars and planets. They're the ones actually making things happen down here.
Okay, whoa, time out. A philosopher's brain is already buzzing right now.
Eh.
So he's saying God's still the ultimate boss, but there's this cosmic hierarchy, right?
Yeah.
With these stars and planets as the middle management calling the shots in the material world.
Exactly. And this includes, us, humans, our destiny, too. He basically said we're all subject to this astral destiny.
Oh, wow. Okay, so if I'm hearing this right, and full disclosure, I'm thinking out loud here, this raises so many questions, like free will. Does that even exist in this framework? Or divine intervention? If the stars are calling the shots, where does God step in?
Boom! You're hitting those philosophical hot buttons right there. It's like, on one hand, you have divine control, ultimate authority. But on the other, it's like, these celestial bodies are running the show. Their influence is practically total. It makes you think, right? About causality, agency. It messes with our whole idea of how God works in the world.
Yeah, it's like if God's in charge, but the stars are running the day-to-day, what does that actually mean?
And these are the exact kinds of questions that philosophers have been debating, for ages. Like, how does this divine plan actually play out in the messy reality of the cosmos?
For sure. And what about something like, I don't know, the human soul? Philosophers, they love to debate about that, what it is, how it's tied to the body, what happens after we die. Where did Ibn Ezra land on all that?
Well, his take on the soul is pretty interesting. He was kind of agnostic about it, admitted that he didn't really know the exact structure, how it connected to the body, said it was just beyond what humans could understand for sure.
But surely he had some thoughts on it.
Oh, he did. He did. He definitely believed there was this element of the soul that was like super similar to the supernal realm, the realm beyond the stars.
Okay. So a spark of the divine within us. That's a pretty classic philosophical idea. It raises all sorts of questions about, where we come from, what consciousness even is, if there's this potential for us, finite beings, to connect with the infinite.
Precisely. And he went even further, saying that nothing at all was closer to God than this spiritual piece of the human soul. And he's a big believer in nurturing that peace. He said that was the key to finding some peace, some refuge from all the struggles and the impermanence of being stuck down here on Earth.
That makes sense. And it actually lines up with a lot of philosophical traditions that emphasize the inner life, the search for something transcending, whether it's spiritual or intellectual.
For sure. And his poetry, it's full of this imagery too, the soul feeling alienated, longing for this higher realm. It's really tapping into these classic philosophical anxieties about what it means to be human, our place in the universe, all that existential stuff.
Definitely. But, the entry points out that while Ibn Ezra was clearly thinking about these really big philosophical ideas, he wasn't doing it in a super systematic, rigorous way.
Yeah.
He wasn't writing those dense philosophical treatises that we're used to. What do you think was going on there?
I mean, it seems like his main focus just lay elsewhere. He'd throw out these ideas, often in his biblical commentaries, but he wouldn't go full-on philosopher mode, He didn't build these complex arguments or dive into every possible philosophical rabbit hole.
Interesting. So less about constructing this grand philosophical system and more about planting seeds of thought, maybe.
Yeah, maybe that's a good way to put it. So, okay, if he wasn't totally immersed in the world of systematic philosophy, what was informing his thinking? Where were these ideas coming from?
Yeah, what were his influences?
Well, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy suggests that Ibn Ezra was kind of like Sa'adi Gaon before him. He was mixing things up, taking elements from Islamic theological discourse, that's kalam, where they used reason to back up religious doctrines. And he was blending that with various philosophical ideas that were floating around at the time.
Ah, so he was living in this intellectual melting pot of Al-Andalus and drawing from all these different sources.
Exactly. And for a philosopher, studying how ideas develop, this cross-pollination, this is where things get really exciting. When different traditions bump into each other, that's when new perspectives pop up.
Totally. So was he deeply studying all these different philosophical traditions?
Well, not really. I mean, the evidence suggests he wasn't hitting the books, doing a deep dive into all the major philosophical works. It seems his main sources were earlier, kind of shorter, medieval Jewish theological writings.
Okay, so this is early Jewish intellectual engagement with theology with some philosophical questions mixed in. The groundwork for what would later become more systematic philosophical work.
Right. Think of it like those early attempts to figure out, how faith and reason fit together.
Interesting. And within this context, the entry points out two major influences for Ibn Ezra. Sefer Yetzirah, which is this mystical text all about cosmology.
And Sa'adi Gaon, yeah. Two very different intellectual vibes there.
Absolutely. You've got the mystical, esoteric leanings of Sefer Yetzirah, and then Sa'adi Gaon, who's more into theological arguments, even bringing in some ideas from Aristotle.
It's pretty wild. Ibn Ezra, he's taking from both, the mystical and the rational, but he's not necessarily trying to create one big, totally unified system.
That's a great point. For a philosopher, this raises questions about how we approach intellectual synthesis. Can you draw from these seemingly different traditions, these different ways of thinking, and create something meaningful, even if it's not perfectly systematic?
Totally. It's his goal wasn't necessarily that philosophical coherence, that striving for a perfect system. Maybe he was after something broader, like a way to integrate different types of knowledge.
It's like he was looking for connections between different ways of knowing.
Maybe. He also mentions Shir Quoma and Sefer Hayhud, other writings from that early period of Jewish intellectual exploration. But, the entry also talks about Ibn Ezra as this cultural mediator.
Okay, yeah, and that seems like a totally different kind of intellectual impact, right?
Totally. It's not about him being this groundbreaking original thinker in fields like math, astronomy, or even astrology, but he was incredibly prolific. And his writings in these areas, they played a huge role in spreading knowledge across Europe, especially among Jewish communities. He made those complex ideas accessible.
So he's like this crucial link in the chain. He's bringing complex scientific and cosmological ideas to a broader audience. And, for a philosopher thinking about how knowledge spreads, that's super important. Even if you're not the one coming up with the original ideas, spreading them, making them accessible, that can have a huge lasting impact.
Absolutely. I mean, think about it. How do ideas actually move through the world? Who are the people translating complex concepts into something that others can grasp? It's not always the original thinkers.
So what made Ibn Ezra so successful in this role?
Well, the source gives us a few clues. He was a hard worker, seriously productive. He traveled all over Europe, so his work was reaching different communities. And his biblical commentaries were really popular, and they were kind of a perfect vehicle for slipping in all sorts of other knowledge, you know?
It's like he snuck in all the scientific and philosophical stuff while people thought they were just getting a biblical interpretation.
Hmm.
Pretty clever.
Right. Plus, he was bringing together rational inquiry with, astrological concepts, which was appealing to a lot of people at the time.
Okay, so he wasn't afraid to blend what we might consider distinct categories of knowledge. And his focus on personal spiritual growth, that probably resonated with a lot of his readers too.
It probably did. But okay, let's zoom in on Ibn Ezra's own view of intellectual inquiry. Like, what did philosophy even mean to him? The entry mentions some Hebrew terms he used that might give us some clues.
Ooh, that's interesting. You can learn a lot about someone's worldview by looking at how they use language.
Totally. And here's the thing. Those Hebrew terms that might be associated with philosophy, with philosophers, they're totally missing from his biblical commentaries.
Okay, that's a pretty big absence. Where did he use those terms then?
Well, there's one example the source points out where he used philosophim. And get this, he's not talking about those guys debating metaphysics or ethics, the classic Platonic or Aristotelian philosophers. He's using it to refer to astronomers.
Ah, so for Ibn Ezra, philosopher might be closer to what we'd call a scientist today. Or maybe just someone who is a scholar of the natural world.
Yeah, it's a different way of carving up the intellectual landscape, right?
Totally. What about other terms?
Well, he used shikl hada'at, which basically means rational analysis, but he used it broadly. Like, it wasn't just about making philosophical arguments. He used it for reason and logic in general, even in scientific contexts.
So again, it points to this idea that he wasn't necessarily thinking of philosophy as this distinct separate domain. He was more focused on empirical observation, logic, and reason applied to specific areas of knowledge.
Precisely. He also used this term hakmei harayot, meaning scholars who base their claims upon proofs when talking about psychology. And the source thinks he might be referring to those practitioners of kalam.
Okay, so even his terminology about psychology seems tied to theological modes of argumentation rather than pure philosophy. It's like we're getting this glimpse into how he categorized knowledge, who he considered intellectual authorities.
For sure. He mentions needing to read a lot of books to really understand psychology, but he doesn't mention any specific philosophical texts. It's like he's engaging with philosophical ideas through this broader cultural lens, not through a deep dive into, the classics.
It makes you wonder, if he had access to those classic philosophical texts, would his approach have been different? Or was this broader, more eclectic engagement with ideas fundamental to his way of thinking?
Big questions. And, speaking of engaging with ideas, we got to talk about his back and forth with Judah Halevi, remember him? His friend and fellow poet.
Oh, yeah, totally.
Yeah.
They had this whole debate about the first of the Ten Commandments, right?
Yeah, it was a pretty deep philosophical exchange, even though it happened within this personal relationship.
Okay, remind me, what was Halevi's issue with the first commandment?
So Halevi was puzzled, right? Why would God choose to reveal himself in the first commandment as the God who freed the Israelites from Egypt? Like this specific historical event for a specific group of people, why not reveal himself as the creator of, everything, heaven and earth?
Ah, that's a really interesting point.
Yeah.
Philosophically speaking, it gets to the tension between particularity and universality in religious belief.
Yeah.
Like, is the emphasis on a specific act of redemption or on the fundamental act of creation?
Exactly. And Ibn Ezra's response, it's classic Ibn Ezra. He says, look, understanding God starts with studying creation, the natural world, the stars, everything. And he saw that first line of the commandment, I am YHWH, as already pointing to this knowledge we get from observing the universe. So mentioning who made heaven and earth would be kind of redundant in that context.
So at first glance, he seems to be leaning towards a more universal approach, right? Like anyone can come to know God through reason and observation of the world around them.
Yeah, but then, and here's where it gets really Ibn Ezra, he brings in astrology. He argues that the stars at the time of the Exodus were actually aligned against the Israelites. Like, astrologically speaking, they were not supposed to be freed.
Whoa, okay. So God had to intervene, override this cosmic destiny to make it happen.
Exactly. And that's his point. God's intervention in this really specific unfavorable moment, it's proof not only of his existence, but also of his power to act beyond, even against, the natural order he created.
So he's using his understanding of astrology to bridge the universal and the particular. The Exodus, this specific historical event, it becomes an example of God's universal power, this ability to transcend those cosmic forces he set up in the first place. It's really amazing when you think about how he's weaving together theology, cosmology, and even astrology to answer those big questions about God and humanity.
Totally. He's saying, look, this God who brought them out of Egypt, it's the same God who created everything, but it's also a God who acts in history, a redeemer who steps in when needed. And, it's interesting to compare this to Halevi, who in his book Kuzari really emphasizes Jewish particularism.
Right. So even though they were close friends, they had these pretty different philosophical understandings of divine revelation, how we come to know God.
For sure. It's a great example of how these big philosophical ideas were being debated, not just in some abstract theoretical space, but within actual relationships, within a specific historical context.
Okay, and before we wrap up, we need to talk about this Neoplatonist label that gets attached to Ibn Ezra.
Yeah.
Philosophers, they always run into these labels when they're studying historical figures.
Yeah. The Neoplatonist label, it gets thrown around a lot with Ibn Ezra.
And why is that?
I mean, it's understandable. He was into astrology, arithmology, that's the study of numbers and their mystical meanings. And he was always talking about this yearning for the spiritual realm. It all sounds pretty Neoplatonic.
Sure, but the entry cautions against just slapping that label on him without thinking about it.
Exactly. When philosophers talk about Neoplatonism in the context of medieval Jewish philosophy, it can get pretty messy.
Okay, so what's the problem with calling Ibn Ezra a Neoplatonist?
Well, he definitely had some things in common with actual Neoplatonists, like Ibn Gabirol, also known as Vessebron. Actually, Ibn Ezra is our only source for some of Ibn Gabirol's allegorical readings of the Bible.
But he wasn't a full-blown Neoplatonist.
That's the thing, he never mentions Ibn Gabirol's most important Neoplatonic work, Fons Vitae, the fountain of life.
That's a big omission. It's like he was aware of these Neoplatonic ideas, they were floating around, but he wasn't necessarily deeply immersed in that tradition.
Right. Plus, there are some key Neoplatonic ideas that he just doesn't agree with. For example, he didn't believe in demons, which some Neoplatonists did, and he's totally silent on things like the soul's descent through the celestial spheres, the whole music of the spheres concept.
Okay, so it's more accurate to say he was using certain Neoplatonic ideas that were popular in both Islamic and Jewish thought at the time, without necessarily buying into the whole system. Like, he was drawing on a Neoplatonic vocabulary, but not necessarily speaking the whole language.
I like that analogy. He was definitely picking and choosing what worked for him.
So maybe more of a Neoplatonic adjacent thinker than a straight-up Neoplatonist.
Yeah, that feels more accurate.
Okay, so we've covered a lot, but there's one more big idea we need to hit. Ibn Ezra's focus on the individual. And for philosophers who are thinking about ethics, about individual responsibility, this is a pretty important shift in religious thought.
It is. He represents this growing emphasis on the individual's salvation, on their personal spiritual journey. It's not just about the collective fate of the Jewish people anymore. And this lines up with what was happening in Andalusian Jewish culture at the time, too.
So it's not just an intellectual shift, but a reflection of broader cultural changes.
Right. And this emphasis on the individual, it's really clear in his book Yesod Mora, especially in how he critiques certain reasons for studying the Torah.
Oh yeah, what was his issue with how people approach Torah study?
He wasn't a fan of studying Torah just to gain social status or improve your standing in the community. He thought the commandments had to have an intrinsic value, a reason for existing that transcended any social context.
I mean, that's a pretty radical idea, right? To say that religious law has to have a meaning beyond just social order.
It is. And for Ibn Ezra, that deeper meaning was about knowledge of God. That was the ultimate purpose of human existence, and it was up to each individual to pursue that knowledge. And the Torah, it was just one way, one tool among many to help you understand God's works.
So even though he valued Torah study, he saw it in this larger context of a personal quest for understanding. And that's a pretty philosophical stance. Like, even without a fully developed theory of knowledge, he's emphasizing individual understanding as the ultimate goal.
Right. He's planting that seed. The individual's journey to knowledge is paramount. So we've talked a lot about Ibn Ezra's ideas, but what about his lasting impact?
Yeah, it seems like he had a pretty big influence both immediately and over time. How have different thinkers understood his work?
His role in transmitting knowledge, bringing those Arabic ideas into Europe, That was huge. And, later commentators, they had all sorts of interpretations of his work. Some saw him as aligned with Maimonides' rationalism, others picked up on more mystical, Kabbalistic themes. Still, others emphasized those universal elements in his thought.
Wow, so one thinker, so many different interpretations.
Right. It really speaks to how complex his work was.
Hmm.
Even centuries later, Spinoza saw Ibn Ezra as this key figure, someone who questioned the idea that Moses wrote the Pentateuch. And that really boosted his reputation as this critical biblical scholar, especially among Christian thinkers.
Interesting. So he's having this ripple effect through history, even influencing thinkers outside of the Jewish tradition.
Definitely. And more recently, modern Jewish philosophers, people like Nachman Krochmal, they found a lot of value in his writings. They were engaging with his ideas centuries later.
It's amazing to think that someone who wasn't a philosopher in the traditional sense could have this kind of lasting intellectual impact.
It is. And so we come back to that question we started with. How did someone who wasn't focused on building these grand philosophical systems, someone who didn't even have formal training in philosophy, how did he become such a significant figure in Jewish philosophical history?
And after this deep dive, what's the answer?
Well, I think what makes Ibn Ezra so fascinating is that his impact came from something other than, those dense philosophical treatises. It came from his unique way of blending theological and cosmological ideas, his willingness to engage with philosophical concepts in this non-traditional way. It came from those stimulating debates he had with other thinkers, and his crucial role as a spreader of knowledge.
He wasn't about revolutionizing philosophy. He was about sparking new thoughts, bringing ideas to new places, and offering this really distinct perspective that resonated across different intellectual and cultural currents.
Absolutely. It shows that philosophical influence can come from all sorts of places. It's not always about the big systematic works. It can be about bringing ideas together, starting conversations, opening up new ways of seeing the world.
And that's something for all of us, especially those of us who are drawn to philosophy, to think about. There's value in engaging with those thinkers who operate on the edges of established traditions, the ones who act as interpreters, who spread knowledge, who spark new questions.
They might not be building the systems, but they're shaping the landscape of intellectual history.
And so, our final thought for you, dear listener, is this. Think about what Ibn Ezra's influence tells us about how philosophy works. How does it move and change and grow? How does it reach new people and spark new ideas? We encourage you to go check out his work for yourself, delve into that fascinating world of medieval Jewish thought. There's so much to discover there.
And who knows, maybe you'll find some philosophical enigmas of your own.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks for joining us.